On this episode, I welcome Saša Zdjelar, Chief Trust Officer at Reversing Labs and operating partner at Crosspoint Capital, to discuss managing supply chain risk. Stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 24, the firmware and supply chain podcast done in collaboration with Eclipsium and the Cyber Risk Alliance. Before we dive into the interview, I want to remind everyone that Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can also sign up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. Saša is the Chief Trust Officer at Reversing Labs and operating partner at Crosspoint Capital with 20 years of Fortune 10 global executive leadership experience. His CTRO scope includes leadership, oversight, and governance of the CSO function, including product security, as well as partnering with other leaders on corporate product strategy, strategic partnerships, and research and customer technology advisory boards, including sponsoring the Reversing Labs CISO Council. Prior to Reversing Labs and Crosspoint Capital, Saša served as the Senior Vice President of Security at Salesforce. Saša, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I don't get an opportunity often to nerd out on a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I'm very excited for this conversation.
Yes, me too. Saša, I just want to start with how you got your start in information security.
Yeah, I started, let's see, probably around 2006, 2007, something like that. At that time, the company I worked for was a very, very large energy company. And, they had their first bits of kind of emerging regulation and compliance frameworks out there, like PCI was starting to hit the scene. And so it kind of became obvious that as a discipline, rather than this being distributed throughout the different service lines, desktop kind of had their own security, servers had their own security, network had their own security. They were starting to centralize all of that into one organization. And they kicked off a number of initiatives around cybersecurity at that time. And so I got involved at that point and have kind of been involved ever since. Started in AppSec, and then moved into pen testing and insider risk and managing a large security fortification program of investments, and anyway, the rest is history.
How did supply chain issues, management, risk, threats, kind of come on your radar and get you going?
Yeah, because I worked in a very large energy company, the concept of critical infrastructure and what supply chain means to critical infrastructure, I think was probably on the scene a lot sooner and in, sort of hallways of government and critical infrastructure discussions much sooner than it was kind of more mainstream like we see it today. So, the discussions that we were having at the time with Homeland Security and FBI and others around, advanced nation states, trying to cause disruption or harm through critical infrastructure, through, energy, through refineries or chem plants, through water treatment plants, power grids, things like that, kind of hit, our radar very soon. And then we all realized that we all depend on someone else's software to run our company.
Yeah.
That is part of our supply chain. And so the two conversations came together to say, wow, if we're dependent on other people's software, or if we're producing some that might be part of someone else's supply chain, and we're in this incredibly, important sector, boy, the intersection of those two things, makes us a big target. And therefore we have to take it much more seriously than others.
Yeah, one of the examples I like to give to kind of kick off the discussion as we delve into supply chain issues is, for example, when I update my Linux system, And it's a very real example because you can really see like the supply chain kind of concerns that you have, because when you do that on your screens, scrolling all of these different things, it's basically pulling down software from places that you and people that you hopefully trust, right? And you kind of just, in certain circumstances, you're like, oh, well, yeah, I trust them, but do you really? And that's what really sparks my imagination and creativity into vulnerabilities and how attackers might leverage that, is when we have to trust the supply chain, such as when we update our Linux system. Is it similar for you, Sasha? And how do we combat this issue of how do we trust the software?
Well, absolutely, it's the same. And I think you bring up an important point that, all of that software comes from different places, but it also lives on hardware that comes from different places. So the combination of, how much do you trust your software and where it's coming from and its components, and then how much do you trust the software that's been put onto those individual components, and where that's come from, its provenance, its chain of custody. I think those are all the combinations of factors, that lead to a lot of risk and need for very advanced solutions.
And along those lines of advanced solutions, I guess we'll start with the easier, like, how do we validate this? And what are some things that we can do to validate it where it's working, where you can validate what is in your environment?
Yeah, and let's maybe borrow an analogy that might resonate with a kind of a broader set of our readers that are maybe not as immersed into, supply chain topics as maybe you and I are. Imagine, pre-ingredients list. You go to the grocery store, and imagine that you couldn't take a box of Cheerios and turn it over and see what was inside it. Today, I think we kind of take that for granted, right? You can go to the grocery store, take any product off the shelf, look at the ingredients list, and say, "Yep, look, I'm a celiac. This thing has, gluten. That's not good for my system. It's not something that I want to have in my system. Therefore, I'm going to avoid, this product." The concept of being able to do that is tremendously powerful today. And I think increasingly, and for all the right reasons, people are asking the question, shouldn't I have the ability to make the same kind of decision for the hardware and software that I bring to our environment? Shouldn't I know the ingredient list that's in this? And shouldn't I then, based on that ingredient list, be able to make a decision whether, this component or ingredient is good for my system and whether I want it in my system or not? I think that's kind of the state that we're in today, is more and more the enterprise expectations, very rightly, are insisting to have that same level of transparency so you can make those decisions.
There are some that believe that, in many circumstances, when we as an organization acquire hardware and software, that it should come with some minimum standard, some diligence to the security and the security of the supply chain within it. But that's not always the case. Yet some people are like, well, isn't that the vendor's problem?
Yeah, I mean, hate to borrow a buzzword here that's back from the cloud days of shared responsibility, but I think that's how it's today being positioned. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but today, even some of what we see emerging out of, SEC Wells notices and, who they're calling up and for what reasons, what we see coming out of CISA, as far as guidance, there's this kind of mixed bag of, well, the producer should definitely sell you a good product, but hey, CISO or leader, you're still responsible and accountable for the eventual security outcome for your entity should something go wrong with someone else's software that you brought into your environment or hardware. So, imagine, again, another analogy from real life. Imagine, you buy a Mercedes or whatever other car, and, the brakes don't work. That would not, while it might be your most immediate problem, it's not just your problem, right? That would lead to all kinds of class action lawsuits, and there would certainly be liability, back in the car manufacturer. I mean, we're in an industry that, if you think about the kind of MBA 101, forming, storming, norming, performing, I think is an industry that's still going through some elements of norming to say, maybe even storming, to say, it is the only industry where the producer can knowingly ship you a bad product and you assume all the risk as a buyer. So the question over, who should have responsibility there is a great one. And I don't think it's settled science right now. Right now, more and more pressure is being ratcheted up through various things, right? We have the executive order 14028 that's asking for a number of things kind of from a supply chain perspective and software bill of materials for anyone who does business with the federal government. or for anyone who does business with someone who does business with the federal government. So as soon as you get kind of two rings out like that, that starts kind of representing, almost the entire tech sector. So you have that, you have legislation like ECRA in Europe, the European Cyber Resilience Act, and in many other geographies around the world that are starting to insist on producers or publishers of software producing knowingly good or at least transparent, validated, trustworthy product. At the same time, you have legislative bodies and regulators saying yes, and not only should they be selling you a secure product, you have an element of responsibility to validate that they've sold you a secure product, because you're still responsible ultimately for the security outcomes should something go wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone asked me earlier this week if software, hardware producers should be responsible for vulnerabilities and claim some liability to that. And as you pointed out very astutely, Saša, that today largely they are not. But it's the knowing that's kind of the interesting thing. Oftentimes when we see vulnerabilities as of recently, the vendor doesn't necessarily know about it until someone else, discovered it and disclosed it. How do we tackle the problem of what vendors know about and what they don't know about?
Yeah, and I'm definitely not, what I'm about to say is not to kind of give them any sort of a pass, because they should take, care to do the appropriate due diligence. But that's easy to say and very hard to do. It's also very possible that a product that's shipped today is perfectly secure,
right, for
what is known today and what's discoverable today and what various tooling will tell you about today's threat landscape and vulnerabilities and whatever risk might live in the environment, while tomorrow, because of a new technique or a newly disclosed 0-day or something, that same product that was just secure up until yesterday is no longer secure today. So, there is an element here where, this is not easy. It's very easy to say and insist on, kind of from a security purist or some sort of, ivory tower. It's easy to pontificate that every vendor should be doing this. It's very, very hard to do. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a level of due care and put in, the appropriate steps to minimize the opportunity for bad things to get out the door. So, are they, doing threat modeling? Are they running static code analysis on it? Are they, do they have a component management or third-party risk management process? Are they running the appropriate scans? All the kind of traditional, I'll kind of almost call it old school AppSec stuff. It's all the stuff that when I started in application security, that's what I did, right? It's all the shift left, do SaaS, to do DAS, to do SCA, all that stuff, and many other things. The unfortunate part is all the things that we've told everyone are the right things to be doing that, we've all spent 10 to 15 years buying, tooling for. Unfortunately, none of those things are good at finding the types of software supply chain problems that get out the door and lead to real breaches. If you look at, Circle CI, Kaseya, SolarWinds, 3CX, MoveIt, and any of these giant breaches that we've had, or supply chain related breaches, they're the nature of what was ultimately discovered and led to the breach or through the compromise of another entity are not the kind of things that SaaS, DAS, and other traditional AppSec tools can find. They were just tools developed for a different purpose in a different era, and they're not finding software supply chain issues shipped. So I'll give you a few examples. You're asking, shouldn't we, what are the characteristics? What is good? How do we define what is good? I think there's a few things that are sort of not controversial that I think we would all agree on. I think we would all agree on that we expect software to be shipped free of malware. I don't think that should be, controversial. I think we should accept or expect software to ship that hasn't been tampered with, that is cryptographically sound, that does not have, embedded secrets or other sensitive information, that does not have any CISA, Kev list, or other critical vulnerabilities, that is not, whose binary behavior or general behavior or network patterns are not something that is, again, broadly considered undesirable. It's not beaconing out to domains in parts of the world that, realistically no software should be, that it's not reaching out and doing secondary downloads of things that are nefarious. There's a number of things that I think are non-controversial that we would all agree on good software should look like.
Saša, what are your thoughts on bug bounties and their ability to help this problem, right? Because I think, in my opinion, bug bounties are popular and effective in many large software organizations, right? Microsoft did, as an example, a great job, with their bug bounty program, and my opinion is they still do. However, I see other pockets in our industry. And again, I don't want to throw stones because we all live in glass houses, right? But I see pockets that aren't adopting bug bounties that have a significant, track record of vulnerabilities in the space, specifically network appliances and VPN appliances as recent examples. Are bug bounties part of the solution here?
I mean, it's very hard for me to say they're not. I've worked in organizations that absolutely categorically refused to participate in bug bounties because it was considered, effectively kind of opening the door to scrutiny of people whose intent and kind of provenance you couldn't really fully control, right? How do you know that the most prized bounty or finding is going to be passed back to you as the company sponsoring the bounty versus on the open market, right? So there's that set of concerns. And some of those companies prefer to hire their own security research and pen testers. Okay, that's a great approach, and I love the justification for those companies that can afford that, right? For those companies that have the budgets and resourcing to effectively duplicate their own same or better than what they would have gotten from a bug bounty program. So I can accept that from a certain kind of category of companies. I've also heard the argument that, it's basically paid extortion, right? Where, some of the stuff that comes in, it's almost like, well, you better pay me or I'm going to make this known. And we've even seen some, very public cases of CISOs that have, been taken to court because how they handled the findings that have come through the bug bounty program. So I will just say it's a space that's more complex maybe than most people realize. I think to a lot of inexperienced security people or first-time CISOs, it just seems like, let's just spin this up. What's the big deal? There's actually a number of legal, broader liability, risk transference, who knows when and where, what is their intent, how are they going to, or how sure can you be that they will tell you what they find versus selling it in the open market. So it's a very complex space. Having said that, I think for the overwhelming majority of organizations who don't have their own deep pockets to go replicate that themselves, I think it's an excellent avenue to get a lot of eyes on a problem. Like in anything else, diversity helps. In this case, getting a lot of different eyes with different perspectives, different testing techniques, different tooling, different experiences, doing same kind of testing across many different entities. I think that diversity of experience and tools and techniques can actually be extremely powerful mechanism to root out vulnerabilities and make product security much better. So I guess at a high level, I would say I'm probably a fan.
Yeah. Along similar lines, how do we compel vendors to include an SBOM that are reluctant for any number of reasons?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is there's kind of three buckets of reasons why vendors struggle with SBOM. One is they just can't generate one. And that sounds maybe, nonsensical to some people, but if you look at the general tooling that's available out there, one thing that people don't realize is that all of these tools fall short very, very quickly once you exceed certain parameters. So for example, try finding a tool that will generate an SBOM for a package that's larger than about 70 meg. Very few can. Mm-hmm. Try finding a tool that can generate an SBOM for a commercial package. I'm only aware of one tool from one company that is able to handle commercial packages. So, like right now, we're collaborating on a unified communication and collaboration platform. People in the world might use Teams, they might use Zoom, whatever they might use. Try taking Zoom.exe and generating, an SBOM for that from a free or open source tool that promises it can generate SBOMs. It can't do that for commercial packages. So, one bucket of reasons why vendors struggle to provide one is they can't generate one. They just don't have the tooling internally to generate one, and they're not willing to pay for one until they have enough pain in sales and promotions to say, okay, this is now justified. We have enough customers demanding it. We have to actually go get some paid commercial tools that can do this well. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is you have companies that can generate an SBOM. They generate it, they look at it, and then they're like, we have a 23-year-old library that we're using. Yeah. Well, okay. So you can't say that.
Right.
We have a certificate that expired 11 years ago. Yeah. Well, we can't say that. So they kind of demur, or I would say they kind of delay until they can clean up things, behind the scenes, so that, the bill of health looks more clean than it would. So that's kind of bucket two, is they can, but they look at it, they don't like the results, and they take some time to kind of clean things up. The third bucket is companies that can, but what they haven't fully reconciled is how do they justify showing a customer who might be paying millions of dollars for a product that actually behind the scenes, this is a bunch of stitched together open source. So, there's an expectation that maybe that might drive down ACV over time and kind of at renewal time contract sizes, because of the kind of the more transparent dialogue about what behind the scenes is real intellectual property versus what is, open source and someone else's work. So, I think that's part of the reluctance. The other reason I would say at a high level is, look, an SBOM can contain some, competitive intelligence. It can contain things that recently were, the Colonel's secret chicken recipe, right? It could be a lot of very useful information to a competitor. So in the conversations that I've had with hundreds of companies, what's interesting is that the SBOM, for now at least, is still being treated not like an ingredient list when you go to the grocery store, right? That's printed on every label. It's actually being treated a lot like a SOC 2 Type 2 or, kind of non-redacted, non-executive overview version of a pen test report. It's, being carefully curated, chain of custody, only under NDA. And when someone is already either a strong prospect or a customer, does it get shared in very limited ways? So it's kind of still perceived as a very restricted document.
Do you think that, so one of my observations recently, Saša, is that several products, if you track the history of them, have come through maybe multiple acquisitions, of that technology passed from company to company. I often find that's a problem point, that software hasn't been updated because it's been passed along in acquisitions. Do you think we suffer from some of that problem as we see acquisitions in the market shrinking a little bit due to acquisitions, that the R&D and development efforts aren't there to support that product?
Yeah, it's very possible. I mean, I think for now, it's still a new enough space where I think a lot of companies are coming to grips with how much of this is this a nice to have versus how much of this is a must have. Customers have just started, due to, when some of the both 14028 and some other, against regulatory pressures, when those come into power and when those start affecting sales cycles and customer interactions, I think that's what drives it. Look, like in anything else, the buyer side will control this. So as soon as the buyer side starts exerting more pressure, right, the buyer CISO starts saying, hey, I don't buy anything until I see an SBOM. And, Gartner recently came out with a paper that actually had a surprisingly strong position. It's not, I would say it's less typical for Gartner to have a very strong assertive statement about something for good reasons, right? They kind of manage their own risk. And they came out very strongly and said, listen, if a product that you're about to buy, if they're either unable or unwilling to share the SBOM, that should be a very serious concern for you and strong consideration not to proceed with acquiring that product. It's those kinds of statements, I think, from research firms. It's the pressure from the buyer side. It's the slow adoption of some of these critical dates for the strong enforcement of the executive orders. Or in Europe, in June of this year, ECRA will come into power, and at that point in EU, any product sold in EU will have to be certified by these independent testing labs, which will require SBOMs. I think it's coming, right? This wave is coming. I think for now, it has not started impacting sales yet strongly enough, for people to prioritize this kind of mainstream.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that compliance and regulation will probably play a major role in helping this supply chain problem. And your example of ECRA, which I was not aware of, that was the model, and because I've proposed similar models, much like the FCC, certifies RF, any gear that transmits on radio frequencies has to be certified to it. And that's a different process, but I liked the model. And it sounds like Europe is also adopting that model. You think that's a trend that will be adopted here in the US?
Look, this is my standard disclaimer, right? I am not a legislation expert, but I play one on TV. So I would say, buyer beware. Everything I'm about to say here is, don't consider it, gospel. But my understanding of it, and I've had a number of discussions with experts in this, is that the model Europe is putting in place will essentially say, we need independent testing labs. These labs actually, for a number of conflict of interest reasons, can't have commercial entanglements, meaning you can't have that lab test something, but be also a VAR that's reselling you product. So for good reasons, they don't want to mix, and lead to any conflict of interest, but that they will have to certify, applications before they can be used and sold on the EU territory. So, your question is, do I see something like this coming to the US? So, Europe is such a distinct market and so distinct from the US in so many different ways. I think in the US, we tend to be much more kind of business friendly, right? We tend to put far more initial consideration on whether any new bit of legislation or regulation may hamper business in some way, make it costlier, make it less likely that a new business can start easily. So we tend to be very business friendly. Again, that's generally served us well. What's interesting is cyber is changing a lot of that. And what we also see in Europe is they don't mess around. And I'll say this as a European myself, right? I'm a proud dual citizen of, Croatia and the United States. So I in some ways I feel like some of what I'm about to say, I can say it. But they sort of don't mess around, right? Think about way back when it came to privacy, right? They're like, well, this is not good. And then they very quickly push through GDPR, which as much as, on the corporate side, if you have to deal with, 14 different works councils and the challenges that come with that, but, what they put in place is not a joke. It's very, very strong privacy legislation meant to protect the citizens, of those different geographies. Look at a more recent example, right? They said, well, we don't like this, proprietary connectors being a revenue stream, and, it's not good for our consumers. And, they're like, nope, thou shalt from now on use USB-C if you want to sell here, and it made a company that is otherwise sort of an immovable object change and adopt a non-proprietary connector for all of its devices in Europe. Right. So I would just say Europe kind of doesn't mess around. When they do something, they do it with more of a tilt towards what's good for their population and for, its citizens versus what is necessarily better for business. Now, what's interesting is eventually that comes to the US as well, right? GDPR passed, I think back in 2000. Maybe 12, something like that, or 16, something along those lines, when it was first starting to be enforced. But now there's conversation, and I hope we don't go down this path. In fact, I participate in a number of kind of policy organizations that are trying to influence some of this, but there's discussion of essentially having almost 50 different variants of GDPR in the US for each state having its own privacy laws. I mean, imagine having to do that in the US with 50 variants, right? So I think there are a lot of concepts that eventually get adopted here as well. And my gut tells me that this is one that's going to take very little time. I think we're already starting to hear signals from the SEC, right, with some of the Wells notices and other signals that they're sending about how they're going to treat this kind of stuff. I think this is coming sooner versus later, and I think it's going to have real enforcement authority, especially given the national security implications. In fact, I would almost argue that we've recently seen the kind of cybersecurity's Enron moment. For those that are around at the time, you remember, Enron effectively disappeared overnight because its accounting practices, which at the time was called mark-to-market accounting, was effectively found to be, not sound, transparent, honest, financial reporting practices. And not soon after, we had Sarbanes-Oxley, which brought a ton of, rigor and standardized sort of expectations for the CFO role. I think we're starting to see something similar happening in cyber right after SolarWinds. We're starting to see a lot of this personal accountability stuff happening. And I think we might see a cyber version of Sarbanes-Oxley coming soon. My point there is just, I think when it comes to cyber, which more and more people are starting to associate with national security and our ability in a geopolitical, increasingly tense geopolitical world to stand on our own, I think people are taking that very seriously and putting in place very rapidly types of regulation.
I want to transition from compliance and regulation a bit, Saša, and go towards some market trends. In my observation, most defensive solutions today are tuned to look for the malicious actors, the bad malware type behavior, not necessarily tuned to say, is this piece of software that you're running behaving in the same way, and is it a supply chain issue? Is that also your assessment, and what are your thoughts on where the market is going?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely my assessment that the risks within software supply chain are much broader and more complex than malware. That is certainly a big concerning aspect, but it's far from the only one. And I mentioned a few of them. You can have you can certainly have malware that ships in a product, and again, your typical control for ensuring that you don't consume a piece of software that has malware in it, for most people, is really limited to whatever maybe their virus scanner can catch, things like that. I mean, what more are you able to do beyond that? Well, unless you have a solution like Reversing Labs, you're really down to just what your AV scanner can do. And your AV scanner, all of them on the planet, doesn't matter where their dot is on the Magic Quadrant, all of them have a file size limitation around 65 to 70 meg. Somewhere in that range, they all fail open, because at the time when they sold us their solutions, right, endpoint or otherwise, the key selling point was no more than 1% impact on your endpoint, right, CPU wide. And, they would all much rather miss things here and there, like everyone else in the industry will, than deliberately be selling a product that their competitors can point at and say, yeah, listen, we're 1%, these guys are 7%. You will definitely lose sales if you do that. So they all draw a line to say, okay, what can we analyze and to what level and stay at this 1%? And it's usually 65 to 70 meg and only 1 or 2 levels deep. And so if a piece of malware comes in a piece of software, which is exactly what happened in SolarWinds, it wasn't particularly sophisticated malware. It was just big. It was 205 meg, and it sailed right through every product out there. So yes, is malware a concern? Malware is absolutely a concern, and very few products in the market can actually find malware that's sophisticated in all of these types of products. But to your point, it's way beyond malware. Software can also simply have been tampered with, right? Where it's not malware, but someone has injected components that, let's just say, have some undocumented features, right? While they're doing a lot of great work for you, it's sending out a copy of all that data to someone else. It's, logging keystrokes. It's, beaconing out to, Russia, China, Iran, or whatever other parts of the world that you might not be aware of or want to interact with command and control things. I mean, it could be doing things that aren't malware per se. So it hasn't been tampered with. Like I mentioned, is it shipping with secrets? You don't want someone else's secrets any more than you want your own or other sensitive information. So yeah, software can be bad in many, many ways that is way beyond malware.
I also feel like that, and folks aren't wrong in tuning their defenses to catch it in the later stages, right? Because usually the earlier stage might be a supply chain attack. Then it transitions to malware that you could probably detect with, more traditional tools or even on the network. My assessment is that, like, we're too late. How do we get ahead of it so that software that we can recognize as having a malicious component or backdoored component doesn't end up in our network and get ahead of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, my position on that would be as a consumer. So as a buyer of someone else's software, the earliest that you yourself can implement your own control to validate that the vendor's assertions are either accurate or not is at the time of your procurement, right? And whether that's procurement that triggers third-party risk management actions or something, but it's at the time of procurement. However, that is still when it's already coming in the door for you? I think the real answer is, we were talking before about whose accountability is it. The real answer is to put these sort of assertions in the producer's SDLC at the end, of their development process, to ensure that what's going out the door does not contain any of these negative characteristics. So, think about again, another real life analogy. A car. A car gets crash tested at the very end when it's fully built, because what you want to see is, how does the system as a whole perform? That doesn't mean, just like in software when we say shift left, it doesn't mean that earlier in the life cycle, a radio volume knob doesn't have its own unit tests and a door and a hood and a sunroof and seats. They go through their own testing for different, tolerances, performance, product quality, but you have no clue how that will perform in a crash test until you put all those things together and then observe, how do those components affect each other in a crisis situation, or in an extreme case like a crash test. I mean, that's the reason why a car gets crash tested at the end, to see how the system as a whole will perform and how the components will affect each other. Today, we don't have an equivalent of that for software. We have, been saying as an industry for 15 years, shift left. Again, that's great for a number of reasons. It's earlier in the life cycle, it's cheaper, you can catch things sooner, it's smaller, bite-sized chunks, it's great. You move left, you gain a lot of kind of component view, but you lose context. As you move right in the SDLC, you gain context, but you lose component views. So, I think to your point, when should it be done or what should be done? I think what we should be insisting on is that our producers subject applications or software to this sort of crash test at the end, to ensure that the components, when packaged together, perform as intended and only as intended as a whole.
Sasha, and this could be self-serving or just my perspective right now, right, based on the work that I do, but I want to say it's a growing trend where malicious actors are getting into systems earlier, in like the boot stage, before the operating system loads, in order to evade all these defenses. Now, some could say defenses are getting better and we're forcing attackers this way. Is this a trend that you're also observing?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's in some ways inevitable or a natural evolution. To your point, hackers are like water. They take the path of least resistance. If our attention and our tooling is fixated on endpoint controls and we're making massive investments in whatever there, and there is an easier way to get in, or a path that is sooner, or in a path that's lower level, ring zero or whatever it is, in a way that's going to subvert or bypass all these places where we're making investments, they'd be silly not to go after these things. So absolutely, rootkits and ability to get in a lower level than what a lot of these tools can run at absolutely should be the prize of hackers out there, and it is.
And I also feel like if folks don't pay enough attention to some of those lower layers, right? And how do we bring that up and get momentum in that area? Because a lot of the defenses that I've seen in more sophisticated malware today is circumventing a lot of the more traditional controls.
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously spent a lot of time on things like SBOM, software bill of materials, but I think just as important are concepts like HBOM. What is the hardware bill of materials? Where did this come from? Who developed it? Who wrote the software that runs on that hardware? Generally, the software that runs the hardware is, firmware. I mean, at an abstracted level, that is just as important to do all these same controls that I just said that apply to kind of layer 7 or traditional enterprise software. Just as important to do that on the software that runs, on our hardware. I mean, I think last time I had a conversation around this, someone told me that something like a typical laptop contains something like 142 components or something like that on average. And, every single one of those. So think about it, whether it's, the graphics processor, or, the CPU, or the, disk drive, if you have one, or the Bluetooth stack, or the display driver, or whatever it is. They all have drivers. They all have firmware. So, most people think about, like, if they're even aware of the concept of firmware, they just think that their device has a firmware. Yeah, the device as a whole has a firmware, and then every component on it has its own firmware that generally gets overlooked. Every single one of those things is just software being written to manage and run the hardware. that should get the exact same treatment as the software that I spent, the first part of our conversation here talking about. It should absolutely have the same rigor, the same kind of expectations of verifiable trust before it ships, because it's just as important, in some cases, even more so because it runs at a lower, more privileged level than a lot of kind of layer 7 or post login software.
Yeah, I feel like it's researchers that highlight these issues, and they're kind of deemed as clever tricks rather than stuff that we really need to incorporate into our security programs, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's it's a part of the there's a few topics that I feel like are these giant blind spots for even most people in InfoSec. Many years ago, I advocated strongly for ERP security. I know it has nothing to do with our conversation here today, but it was another area where I felt like the industry just didn't have enough understanding and was not spending enough time. But it's only where every large corporation's crown jewels are and its most important data, where they run or execute all of their most critical corporate value chains, like order to cash and hire to retire. But it was a tech stack and a protocol stack that was not commodity. And most people who were, web app pen testers or whatever had no clue what to do with it. And so it was kind of like this blind spot for them. I think the area that, we're talking about today, supply chain, or in particular firmware security and that area is another giant blind spot for the overwhelming majority of the InfoSec industry. And I'm just thrilled that in the last couple of years, it's starting to get more and more attention, and a bigger light is kind of being shined on this space.
Saša, I'm just curious about your work at Crosspoint Capital. I did get that right, didn't I?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So what do you do at Crosspoint Capital? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I'm what's called an operating partner. So I work with our portfolio companies, and at a high level, I just sort of help them be better and do better. At the moment, I'm deployed at Reversing Labs as the Chief Trust Officer.
That's awesome. What's your most common pieces of advice for cybersecurity companies that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is extremely broadly applicable to everyone, but, and it's going to sound like such either buzzword bingo or, maybe commodity advice, but I promise you it's not commodity, which is, please take the time to understand the business that you're trying to sell to. Mm. They're not all created equal. They have different boom and bust cycles. If you're selling to companies that sells commodity, or a utilities company or an energy company, look at the price per barrel. Look at how the markets are affecting the product that they sell and what that likely means for their budgets, their investing cycles. When do they kind of tighten the belt versus when do they go on a lot of capital expenditures, and understand that so that you know how to position better to them. If you're selling in tech, similarly, read the tea leaves, look at the industry, look at layoffs, look at trends, understand the tech that they're selling and what may matter to them. One company may be far more worried about protecting intellectual property. Another one might be far more worried about, their brand and reputation. Another one may have a much higher sensitivity to ransomware. Don't treat them all the same, is my point, is learn as much about the business as you can before attempting to sell to them.
Outstanding. Any closing thoughts, Saša, on supply chain management?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I would close with is, for anyone who's listening to this, and either it's because this is an area of passion for them already, or they're kind of new to the space, or they heard that this is kind of an emerging thing, but that they want to learn more about it and what it is. I would just say kind of buyer beware. You're going to see, like a few years ago, you had, zero trust plastered on everything imaginable because everyone wanted to, in some way, be a zero trust vendor when that was a hot, buzzword. This past year, clearly AI is a big one, and everyone's adding something AI related, whether they're doing any actual AI or not. I think what you're going to start seeing, and some of this is already there for a lot of companies that do supply chain, is, just make sure you're aware of what matters to you. If what you're interested in is software supply chain, think about the type of software that your business actually runs on. The industry, I think, is having a little bit of a misguided conversation on this as a whole. So when people hear software supply chain, I think their minds tend to gravitate first towards open source. Somehow, I think those two terms have become synonymous, or more synonymous than others. So think about that for a second. I just did a presentation a few weeks ago at a big, American Petroleum Institute, conference, and I spoke to a room of about 400 CISOs in that space. And I said, look, how many of you, last time you had a large ERP project upgrade, how many of you went with an open source tool instead of, SAP or Salesforce or something like that? And of course, no hands went up, right? I said, okay, well, when you needed to pick a unified communication and collaboration platform, how many of you went with something open source instead of Teams and Zoom? No hands. How many of you use something open source for, critical corporate value chains or your treasury management system? Of course, no hands went up. So my point is, what large enterprises and corporations and even small companies run on is they run on commercial software. They run on paid commercial software made by others. So make sure that when you're looking for tooling out there and solutions that can help protect your software supply chain, that they can actually protect your actual supply chain, not some theoretical. Your supply chain is made up of, software supply chain is made up of very large, complex commercial packages, and make sure that you are looking for solutions that can handle very large commercial binaries and packages and of various file types and sizes and extensions. That's what your business actually runs on. And there's a lot of people out there, selling solutions that only handle open source. In fact, that's what everyone is selling in software supply chain is open source solutions, and that's not what businesses run on.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's supply chain gets that overloaded term, right? And you have to kind of break it down for which vertical you're talking about, right? You go hardware, low level. I call it third-party software versus the open source versus software that you write, right? All of those have supply chain implications, and they're all different.
Right.
Fantastic. Saša, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. This was a blast, and I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely. With that, that will conclude this episode of Below the Surface. Thanks for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.